welcome back to New Sunrise. We are now operating in the rather gloriously redesigned 0.21, which features a few different changes. The first and most obvious is that we can now rotate the space sensor, and it also responds to the daytime inside the save. Another thing is that the tracking station had a very distinct remodeling. And we also have the astronaut complex over here, which is good because we can now actually assign various personnel to our craft as well as take them off it. So if I want to have a craft that starts off empty and is then populated by someone else, I can. It also means I can keep people like Bill and Bob, and Jeb is running around here somewhere from dying, which is good. Although so far I haven't killed anyone. Certain things in actual flight have changed. You can't end a flight, for example. You can only revert it. You by default end it when you crash, but ideally that doesn't happen. So our main thing today is that we're investigating SSTOs. They're the abbreviation stands for single stage to orbit. They're a vehicle that is considered basically the most efficient you could possibly be, in that it is exactly the same when it takes off as when it finally reaches orbit, and ideally when it comes back as well. Very good if you're trying to build some kind of workhorse craft for our kind of systems, where we're going from planetoid, station, anywhere, land. But there are a few kind of issues with them. I've had a route around, and I talked to a few guys who've had a bit more experience with this than I have, and I did manage to dig up a couple of examples. The most successful one I've found so far is the Elysium Mark IV, which was designed by Macy Dean. You can find him on YouTube under that. Very talented guy, very cool stuff. And as you can see, it is pretty plane-like, more or less. But at the back here, we can see that we have two jet engines. These are basic jet engines, and a rocket engine. Now, the reason that's there is because the jet engines have much better fuel efficiency when you're in an atmosphere, and they're very good for when you're actually being like a plane, because that's what an SSTO generally has to be. It has to be a plane and a rocket melded into one as best as it possibly can, more or less. You're usually not going to achieve the same kind of effectiveness at either one with an SSTO, but the fact that you can combine them is very handy. So what basically happens here is we've got the big ramjets over here, which get the intake air for the jet engines. So use those to get yourself to a fairly high altitude, and then when the intake air comes along, you shut these off because they flame out when they don't have enough intake air, and that causes you to go into horrific spins, which then means that your altitude drops, so you get air, so they spark up again, but then you go up, and it just causes all manner of mess. And then you kick in with the rocket engine, which is a liquid-fueled engine, to get you actually into space and then into orbit. And at the front here, there's a very small little satellite. We can probably find more other things. And I've mostly for most of the work that I've got actually running in the world at the moment, I've just been retooling the things that go into this. So I've made unpiloted ones, because this is actually piloted. If we go to the crew roster here, we can see that there is a command pod where currently Bill is registered. But I don't usually send anyone along with this. And there's also these different struts here which you can fold away for when you want crew members to get on and off. And also an interesting thing that Macy included here is these landing struts. He actually designed, or at least accounted for this thing to be able to take off vertically, like a rocket, which is pretty cool. I don't know how necessary that is, but it's a handy feature. It's a very handy feature to have. Now, while I was away, I also installed a couple of new mods. The first and perhaps most helpful is this one, the Kerbal Engineering System and Flight Engineer. Comes in 3 different flavors of various expense for the most part. That's more or less the only thing, but if you stick one onto your plane, you get these handy little loadouts. So you can see all of these different things. You can see what it would take to get off the air and stuff. You can reference it to all things. You can check all the different bodies. I usually just keep it as that, because that's the main things I need to know is the delta V, which is effectively your power on how you can get to various places. You need about 4,500, I think it is, to get to orbit here on Kerbin. But the next thing I installed, besides having to reinstall the Keyvane mod as well as Chatterer down here, is I installed the Kerbal attachment system, because I got talking to a guy called Katatayoichi. You'll see his name either in bold letters on the screen right now or down below in the description, because he is really cool and you should really check him out, which basically adds winches, which are little things that we can have our Kerbals go and pick up and attach to their backs and plug into something else, and then we can retract it or extend it to lower things, raise things, bring things close together to ultimately dock. We can also transfer fuel through them, and there's also a couple of different attachments. So for example, there is the anchor, which to be used for boat, airship, or everything else. In addition to its weight, it also provides drag and friction when touching the ground. So basically exactly what it says. It's a great way to have a sort of non-ground level kind of braking system. There's also the grappling hook, which is a similar thing, but you can go vertically with it. And there's the electromagnet for when you just can't get to something, just shoot it at it. Pretty handy stuff, and I've been including them in a few of my more recent designs as I've been tinkering about. So, what does it take to build an SSTO? Well, there's a list of rulings, a list of rules that I've managed to come up with. So let's bring up all of these. So these are the center of mass is the yellow one, the center of lift is the blue one, and the center of thrust is the purple one at the back there. So the rules are that the center of gravity needs to be kept centralized. It should be roughly at the exact center of your space plane or your SSTO, whatever you want to call it. And the reason for this is because the mass of the rocket, well, because you can't jettison stages, as you run out of fuel, the parts that held that fuel become lighter, and consequently that causes the mass of your craft to shift around. This is very bad when you're an SSTO, or indeed just a space plane, because it means that your center of mass is changing, and if your center of mass is changing, then your thrust and direction of travel is going to change to suit it. As fuel drops in an SSTO, you really want your center of gravity to stay the same. This also has an advantage that makes you a bit more maneuverable. The center of thrust, which is remembering that purple one at the back, needs to be in line with the actual center of gravity. This is so that, if we have the center of gravity and we have the center of thrust, if they're aligned, then the center of thrust is pointing directly into the center of gravity, and it pretty much goes where you point it. If they're off-center, if they're not in line, then basically your craft just starts spinning out of control very quickly and very painfully. That's a fairly good rule to keep for most craft in Kerbal Space Program. And then there's the center of lift, which is the blue one here, and that's really the one that you really need to take care of. Because that determines sort of how your craft will handle. If your center of lift is ahead of your center of gravity, then it means that you're a lot more maneuverable, which is good if you're a high-speed craft. But if it's behind it, then it means you're a lot more stable, which is good for a low-speed craft. So that's kind of what you need to keep in mind. Now, the closer these are together, which is to say that here we can see that the center of lift is slightly below the center of gravity, just by virtue of the points that are sticking out of it. The closer they are together, the more responsive you have of a craft. Next, we need to consider fuel, and these, all three engines in the Elysium here are using liquid fuel, plus an oxidizer, which is factored in as well. Now, the reason you want to use liquid fuel is because you can't refuel a solid fuel booster. You have to ditch it. So if you're building an SSTO, liquid fuel is basically mandatory. But this does have the benefit that you can actually make reusable SSTOs. You don't have to fire them once and forget about them. Control systems, you have the two choices. One is SAS and one is RCS. And the difference there is that SAS uses these control surfaces, so sort of like how the winglets on a plane hold it at certain angles and stuff. Very good, mandatory when you're a space plane and such, because it can react faster than you can. And especially in the most recent updates of Kerbal Space Program, it is extremely responsive. You can pretty much like turn your craft and it will stay there, barring anything acting upon it. It's very good. SAS is what? I've got that the wrong way around. I think RCS is the one for space. SAS is the one for this. And the reason that you want, well, I'm gonna put my cursor over here so I remember. Okay, The RCS is used for space. There is no air in space, so the winglets on a spaceplane and SSTO can't function. There's nothing to like push against to reorient the craft. So the way that RCS works is it just ejects a stream of gas, monopropellant, which you do have a limited supply of, unfortunately, and that basically simulates the same kind of forces that you get with the SAS to actually like change things around. Ideally, you want both. You don't, strictly speaking, need the RCS because of the way that the internal gear systems work, which are these, the inline reaction wheels, which come in most parts of these ships. You can use those to reorient the craft, and that's how the International Space Station turns around. Point of note. So you don't, strictly speaking, need RCS, but it does help to keep you a lot more stable, because, again, it reacts faster than you can. Now, in terms of our requirements with regards to New Sunrise, we have a few things to fulfill, which is that we need to have a craft that's capable of producing about 12,000 meters per second of delta V. That's this number over here. The reason that we need that is because that is about as much as you need to get to orbit from the hardest to get to orbit planet in the Kerbal system, which is Eve. The reason being that the Eve has much heavier gravity and much more dense atmosphere. And we want this ship to be able to go to orbit from any planetoid, because if it goes to one planetoid and gets stuck, then it's not really useful anymore. It can't get off the ground anymore. It's basically a rock. And then we need it to be able to fly with an unoxygenated environment, which is to say, an atmosphere that doesn't have oxygen in it. This is a problem because the jet engines all require intake air, and that intake air has to be oxygenated. So that's these things here. You point your ship towards where you're going, the wind naturally goes down it, gets squeezed, injected with fuel, and shot out the back. That's how a jet engine works. And you need an O2 environment for that. Planets like Eve don't have an oxygenated environment, so jet engines don't normally work there. There is one way that we can get around that, which is this zero bypass turbine, which does work without an oxygen, which is a huge advantage. Slight problem, it burns keyphane, and when you use keyphane, you don't spawn on the tarmac with a tank full of keyphane, or else there wouldn't be much point to actually like mining it. But if we compare the two, there's the basic jet engine. Maximum engine power 150, maximum engine power 200. ISP at sea level 2000, ISP at sea level 22,300, ISP in vacuum 1000, vacuum 1000, and then everything else is more or less the same. The bypass engine does have some advantages. The main problem is actually getting fuel for it. So that's one option we have for like getting over the fact that Eve doesn't have an atmosphere conducive to jet engines. And then we have the perks. Ideally, as we can see here, this is the first one that I put together to actually start designing my own kind of SSTO based on my experience with some of the ones I managed to find, in Macy's especially. Here we have a craft that is entirely piloted by probe. That's what this big thing at the front is. That is the Stay Putnik Mark II. And the reason we want probe control is, in the event that we do get stuck on a planet, I don't want a Kerbal dude stuck there for all of eternity. So we want to actually have like a way for these machines to control themselves, so that I don't have to risk innocent Kerbal lives, because people got kind of angry at me in the press after the unfortunate firing of one particular personnel last episode. Yeah, I'm under investigation for that. That's not good. So yes, we want probe control. We definitely want docking. Docking is important not only for the sharing of fuel, especially from the resupply stations that we'll have around all the different planetoids, but also for transferring personnel. So, for example, if we have a big tanker flying around in space that's just delivering personnel from place to place, we need it to be able to dock. Keyphane storage is an ideal, so we can actually transport keyphane from wherever we're mining it to those supply depots. And then the winches, we definitely want to be using the winches. These guys are really handy. You can have all manner of fun stuff with these, because you can like use this one, which is dismountable, which means you can attach it to any part of a ship. Not even necessarily the same ship it came from. So that's like an ad hoc, oh dear, I need to get fuel onto this ship, but it has no port. Grab a radial connected port, dismantle, attach it, go. I think it's probably going to be a standard that I will actually have a connector port on all of these ships, but just in case, for like a specialist ship or a ship that's like collecting debris, for example, we could use that. Although for that, we might just use the electromagnet. So some progress, meanwhile, because again, we have to, if we're going to have the zero bypass turbine, we're going to need to actually get some keyfane, and there has been some progress on that notion, because I've gotten a heck of a lot better at actually launching satellites. So if we go to our tracking station, yep, I re-enabled the keyfane grid because navigating without the view of it was kind of annoying. We can see I've launched 2 major satellites. Keyfane 1 is this one that's on the very odd orbit. That was one of my earlier ones, but it was the first successful one to be carrying keyfane mapping systems. And it was the one that's responsible for this lovely band around the middle of Kerbin. Picked up a fair bit of keyfane there, but we haven't mined anything just yet. And the second one that I launched, which has been a lot more helpful, is the K-map satellite, and that's based on a stock model called the Z-map satellite, which I believe is used for telecommunications, not that basic Kerbal has them. And that's responsible for the vast majority of this, because it has this orbit that goes sort of slightly off-kilter to actual Kerbin. So what happens is Kerbin rotates, it spins around, and that just gradually just creates a sort of spirograph effect around the entire planet, which is why we've got most of it. A lot of these points look a bit broken up. That's because it's actually moving faster than it can scan, but because the orbit is stable, it keeps going around. And then there is one other interesting section here, which is here. Roughly there is where Kerbal Space Program is. And this section here, which looks a bit weird now that it's being kind of covered over by the tracks of the K-map satellite, is where I built a small little jet plane, basically. Stripped it down to its barest components, gave it a bunch of fuel, and let it fly. And I just sent that off with a probe body to try and see if we could find some keyfane that's close to actually Kerbal Space Center, so that I can go and mine it and bring it back over for anything that's on the tarmac. That's where the problems come in. Because if we see, roughly this side of the planet is Kerbal Space Center. This side of the planet is half a planet away. And that's where more or less all of the keyfane appears to be. Because you can see we found very little over here. There's like this, and what's more is that for some reason, a lot of it seems to like to spawn in water. So there's this almost an entire like vein here that's just underwater. There's like tons of keyfane there. That one is on another continent. That one is under the ocean. That one's on another continent. That's like past the North Pole, which is a slight problem with the K-map satellite's orbit, is that it creates this nice little pentagon shape at the poles, but it doesn't actually map them. Although the little jet plane that I sent out to look for keyfane actually did a fairly good job with its fuel reserves. I did set it up so that if it did find some keyfane, it could refuel itself, but it never did. So this is roughly the kind of region we would want to find keyfane in, but we haven't had such luck. But also in my experimentation, this was one of my other little experiments. This was one of my earlier attempts applying the rules for making SSTOs. Didn't fly very fast, didn't have much chance of making it actually into orbit, and though it did glide exceedingly well, like it got down to about like 4 meters per second, and then I kind of tweaked it a little bit and it flew into the side of this mountain. But what's interesting is I spotted a little Easter egg while I was here, which is this thing over here, and I gather that is an old Air Force base on Kerbin. So someday we might actually go and visit that. There's a bunch of different Easter eggs throughout the Kerbal system on the different bodies, but I have not been able to visit any of them as yet. And if I go back to the Space Center, and then back into the tracking station, we can check out some of the more fun I've had. and then we can end the episode. So let's see, we have a ship running around. Or is it a rover? There it is. I renamed it so I wasn't entirely sure. So here we have Jeb's camper. So if we go check this out, this is where Jebediah is hanging out at the moment. Because this was my first experiment using the Kerbal attachment system, because I pretty much saw what Katati, I'm just going to call him Cat. I pretty much saw what Cat was up to. He's done like some really cool stuff with the Kerbal attachment system and some robotics mods as well. So this was originally 2 different ships, more or less identical. But this one drove off quite happily with its probe core, and this one drove off the little tarmac to our right here, and then promptly the top of it fell off. But that was perfect, because at the front of it was a actual like connector port for the Kerbal attachment system, and whereas at the front of this one there was a stack winch. So I had Jeb pop out of his crew hatch here, and then he ran over to this one, grabbed the port, and then properly attached it to this, and after a little bit of fiddling, we did finally manage to actually get it to connect and dock. So that's another thing. These winches do serve as docks, which is fantastic when you're in space and say you're low on one on propellant or something, because you can just have a Kerbal go on EVA, grab the port, run over the ship, and then just start retracting it over, and it connects wonderfully. So if I tell this, let's just show the GUI because it's so much easier to use. Let us extend that. Yeah, you can see it's quite happily dropped there. I need to turn the brakes off. Let's tell that to stop now. And I forgot this was actually built in reverse. Okay, so there we go. There is our winch. Let us brake. Hold the brakes. And if we start to retract, it's now taut. It's pulling it over. And because we're in gravity, this isn't the most graceful of things to do. And I think we've more or less already lost 1 light from that thing. And there we go. Fully retracted. Very handy. And if I wanted to, I could disconnect this and have Jeb go and reattach it or something. But it's a fantastic way of just like dealing with bodies that aren't initially connected, but you want them to be connected, so they're kind of being annoying, among with the different things. But that is more or less all we have for today. I would show you some the launches of some of my earlier designs here that I've been tinkering with for SSTOs. But apparently I rambled a little bit too much. Oh well. Hopefully you've learned something. I have definitely been having a lot of fun finding out these various things that help us get things working. Whoop. And there is Jeb, so yep. Yeah, I've named this thing Jeb's camper because hey, he just happened to be the guy that came into it. We can now recruit new Kerbals. I'm trying again not to kill any, but we can recruit them. So let's have Jeb run over here and see if we can disconnect that. There we go. Okay, and grab the connector. This is one of the great things, is we now have a Kerbal on a leash, which is great if you're going on a dangerous EVA, because you can attach the winch to the back of the Kerbal, like before they've even left the ladders, and then just retract it when you want them to come back. So, unless you have an encounter like the movie Gravity, you shouldn't have a problem. But that's it for today. So, from everyone here at New Sunrise, and especially Jeb here, who is very happy with his camper van, catch you next time. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and or favorite. Follow me on Twitter and subscribe to be notified of future updates. You can also check out the website where most other content is uploaded. That's all for now. Catch you later.